Paris, September 8, 2025. The streets are burning. Not metaphorically, but literally. Water cannons, tear gas, and the echo of sirens fill the air as tens of thousands of riot police flood the capital. For the fifth time in just 2 years, a French prime minister has been forced out. To most of the world, this chaos looks sudden, unexpected, unexplainable. But for those who have been watching Africa closely, this was inevitable. What you are witnessing is not simply a political crisis. It is the collapse of an economic illusion that lasted 80 years. It is the unraveling of a system that depended on silence, obedience, and ignorance. And when Africa finally said no, the house of cards came crashing down. Decades ago, a handful of African economists warned that France had built its entire financial stability on what they called colonial economics without colonies. And they pointed to one quiet but powerful mechanism that connected Paris to 14 African countries, a currency most of the world had never heard of, the CFA franc. This was not just money, it was control. Half of those nations' foreign reserves were held in the French treasury. Half of their wealth sat in Parisian vaults. France could decide their exchange rates, block their access to capital, and profit from their savings. For nearly a century, this hidden arrangement kept France's economy stable and its borrowing costs low. It was colonialism in another form, wrapped in technical jargon. But when African nations finally voted to break free, France discovered that its foundation was made of sand. The CFA franc cracked, the uranium trade collapsed, and the invisible empire that sustained Paris for generations began to fall apart. The world called it a surprise. Africa called it justice. And for the first time in modern history, France faced the one thing it had never prepared for, an Africa that refused to play along. To understand what happened to France in 2025, we have to go back to 1945. Europe was in ruins. France was broke, its industries destroyed, its empire collapsing. The nation needed money, influence, and a way to rebuild fast. What Paris created next would become one of the most powerful and controversial economic systems in modern history. It began with the invention of a currency called the CFA franc. On paper, it was designed to stabilize trade between France and its former colonies in West and Central Africa. In reality, it became the financial weapon that guaranteed France's prosperity for generations. 14 African nations were required to use this currency. They had no choice, and half of their foreign reserves had to be deposited directly into the French treasury. That meant that even after independence, their money, their savings, and their economic future were controlled from Paris. The French government could decide their exchange rate, dictate their borrowing power, and use those African reserves to finance its own industries. For decades, the system worked perfectly. For France, between 1970 and 2008, more than $850 billion left Francophone Africa through underinvoicing, capital flight, and profit repatriation. The money that could have built schools in Bamako or hospitals in Ouagadougou was building luxury apartments in Paris instead. The CFA franc was the foundation, but the real lifeline was uranium. Deep in the deserts of Niger lies some of the richest uranium deposits on Earth. France's energy empire depends on it. Around 65% of French electricity comes from nuclear power, and a large portion of that uranium came from Niger. Here is the shocking part. Niger's annual uranium revenue was about 100 million euros, barely 5% of its national budget. Meanwhile, France converted that uranium into nuclear energy, exported electricity across Europe, and made nearly $74 billion in profit from it each year. The same uranium that kept French lights on left entire African villages in darkness. When Niger's leaders tried to change the deal, France refused. In 2014, President Mahamadou Issoufou proposed increasing royalties from 5.5% to 12%, a modest request compared to global standards. French authorities called the demand unrealistic. When Niger insisted, French mining company Orano halted operations, claiming maintenance issues. Everyone understood what it meant: pressure. This pattern repeated across the region. Whenever African nations asked for fairer deals, France threatened to cut projects, delay loans, or block aid. The imbalance was clear. France bought African resources at prices far below global market value, and sold finished products back to the continent at inflated rates. It was not trade, it was extraction. For a long time, few outside Africa noticed. But in the 2010s, something changed. Smartphones, social media, and digital transparency made it harder to hide. African journalists and economists began exposing the truth. They uncovered systematic underreporting in mining exports. Companies declared 600 tons of uranium, while exporting 1,000. The missing 400 tons represented billions in untaxed profit funneled back to Europe. At the same time, activists started movements to end the CFA franc. Young Africans demanded sovereignty over their currencies and natural resources. Hashtags like #StopTheCFA trended across West Africa. The new generation was not afraid to confront the old powers. By 2019, leaders began to listen. Benin's President Patrice Talon publicly stated that it was time for Africa to manage its own money. That statement ignited a chain reaction. One by one, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad began pushing back. They expelled French troops, stopped depositing reserves in Paris, and renegotiated their contracts. Paris had built its house on sand, and the foundation was cracking. France was not just losing influence. It was losing the hidden financial structure that had kept its economy stable for nearly a century. When Niger finally closed its uranium supply in 2023, the impact hit France like a tidal wave. Energy costs skyrocketed. Inflation surged. The state-owned nuclear giant Orano reported massive losses. For the first time, France felt the cost of its own dependence. What began in 1945 as a clever economic plan ended in 2025 as a financial catastrophe. The system designed to rebuild France had become the very system that destroyed it. As the cracks in France's African empire widened, what had been whispered in academic circles turned into a global spectacle. The illusion of partnership was gone. The numbers spoke for themselves. For decades, France had hidden behind diplomacy, claiming cooperation and mutual development. But in reality, it was dependence disguised as friendship. Now, that mask was falling apart. In Niger, people began to realize the depth of the injustice. The uranium beneath their feet had powered Europe for half a century, while their own homes remained in darkness. Activists published reports, economists shared data, and journalists exposed years of underreporting and manipulation. They showed that for every ton of uranium France declared, another ton quietly vanished into unrecorded shipments. The profits were staggering, and the deception undeniable. The young generation was no longer silent. From Dakar to Ouagadougou, protests erupted. People burned CFA notes on camera, shouting that their future had been stolen. The footage spread across social media, turning what was once a local issue into a continental movement. The world began to pay attention. Hashtags like #StopTheCFA and #FreeSahel became rallying cries for a new Africa, one that refused to be exploited by anyone. By 2023, the anger had reached a tipping point. Military and civilian leaders in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began coordinating politically and economically. They created the Sahel Alliance, a new front built on independence and cooperation. This alliance was not born from ideology, but from exhaustion. They were tired of being told what was possible, tired of waiting for fairness that never came. Their message was clear: no more unequal contracts, no more hidden debts, no more resources traded for promises. When the governments of these nations ordered French troops to leave, it was not a diplomatic disagreement. It was a declaration of freedom. Paris watched in disbelief as one country after another rejected its presence, its currency, and its authority. For France, this was unthinkable. The empire had long been gone politically, but economically it had survived through influence. Losing that influence meant losing control of entire sectors that had quietly supported the French budget for decades. The CFA reserves that once stabilized the Eurozone, the uranium that fueled 65% of France's electricity, and the gold and oil contracts that filled corporate coffers were slipping away all at once. Behind closed doors, panic set in. French officials met in emergency sessions, scrambling to manage what they called an unprecedented economic shock. Reports warned that energy shortages were inevitable, that the Treasury would lose billions in foreign reserves, and that France's borrowing costs could spiral out of control. But the real fear was psychological. For the first time, France had to confront the possibility that Africa no longer needed it. Meanwhile, the movement in Africa grew stronger. It was no longer just about France. It was about self-determination. Across the continent, new economic partnerships were forming. Nations began negotiating directly with BRICS members, exploring gold-backed trade and regional digital currencies. For the first time, Africa's wealth was being discussed on its own terms. France's strategy of denial only made things worse. Instead of acknowledging the legitimacy of Africa's grievances, French leaders dismissed them as populism and nationalism. That arrogance deepened the divide. The Sahel Alliance responded by strengthening ties with one another, forming new trade corridors, and rejecting French aid altogether. The tension between Paris and its former partners reached a breaking point in mid-2024, when Niger officially suspended uranium exports to France. The announcement sent shockwaves through European markets. Energy prices soared, factories slowed, and public anger spread from African capitals to French streets. Protesters in Paris, struggling with record inflation, began to ask why their government had spent decades depending on a continent it treated as inferior. By the end of 2024, France's nuclear giant Orano reported a loss of over 130 million euros. The ripple effects spread across industries. Without cheap uranium, energy prices increased by 40%. Small businesses closed. Workers protested wage freezes. The social fabric began to tear. This was no longer an African rebellion. It was a global realignment. The same countries that France had once controlled were now dictating the terms of engagement. African leaders were not demanding charity, they were demanding equality. And for France, a nation built on the myth of grandeur, that realization was unbearable. The dragon it had fed for decades was now breathing fire back at it. France could not bomb this problem, negotiate it away, or hide it behind colonial nostalgia. The foundation of its wealth had collapsed. The question was no longer how to stop the fall, but how to survive it. As the protests in Paris grew louder, the rest of the world began to understand what Africa had always known. No empire lasts forever when its prosperity depends on another people's silence. By the time 2025 arrived, France was no longer the stable European power it once appeared to be. The unraveling that began quietly in the Sahel had turned into a full-scale domestic crisis. The streets of Paris were filled with anger, not only from African leaders abroad, but from French citizens at home who were finally paying the price of a system built on imbalance. The energy crisis hit first. When Niger and its neighbors cut off uranium exports, France's nuclear power grid, once its pride and symbol of technological strength, was thrown into disarray. Energy companies scrambled to find new suppliers, but prices for uranium on the global market had already surged. Electric bills skyrocketed, and industries dependent on cheap energy began to collapse. Factories slowed their production, layoffs increased, and the unemployment rate reached its highest level in 20 years. In the first half of 2025 alone, the French nuclear firm Orano reported a loss of 133 million euros. Power shortages spread across parts of the country. For decades, France had exported electricity to its European neighbors. Now, it struggled to keep its own lights on. The irony was painful. The very nations that Paris once dismissed as developing were now holding the key to France's survival. The financial situation was no better. France's public debt surpassed 3 trillion euros, more than 110% of its GDP. The bond markets began to lose faith. For the first time in modern history, France's borrowing costs exceeded those of Greece, a country that had nearly gone bankrupt a decade earlier. The Eurozone trembled at the possibility that one of its founding members might be the next domino to fall. Inside the National Assembly, chaos reigned. Prime Minister François Bayrou presented an emergency budget that proposed 44 billion euros in cuts, reductions to welfare programs, and the elimination of public holidays. His message was simple: work more, earn less, save France. Parliament rejected it by a massive margin. The vote of no confidence passed with 364 votes to 194. Bayrou was out, becoming the fifth prime minister in only 2 years. On the streets, the people erupted. The French public, already suffering from inflation and austerity, had no patience left. Protests turned violent. Roads were blocked, public buildings were set on fire, and more than 80,000 police officers were deployed to contain the unrest. The government was paralyzed. President Macron struggled to find a replacement, but no one wanted the job. Underneath the chaos, a deeper truth was becoming impossible to ignore. France was not just facing a political crisis. It was confronting the collapse of an economic model that had sustained it since World War II. The colonial era had supposedly ended, yet its financial mechanisms had never been dismantled. The CFA franc, the resource monopolies, and the cheap energy from Africa had all been invisible pillars of France's prosperity. Once those pillars were removed, the entire structure began to fall. Meanwhile, In Africa, a new sense of confidence was growing. The countries that had broken away from French influence were not descending into chaos as Paris had predicted. Instead, they were forming stronger regional alliances, negotiating new trade deals with partners in Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The narrative of dependence was being rewritten into one of independence. African leaders began investing in domestic industries rather than exporting raw materials. They created new banking systems to manage their reserves locally. The Sahel Alliance and other regional blocs coordinated to protect their markets and ensure fairer trade. Slowly, the balance of power that had favored Paris for nearly a century began to tilt southward. Inside France, some economists admitted the truth. Without Africa, France could no longer sustain its welfare programs, its energy subsidies, or its global ambitions. The French economy had been built on extraction disguised as partnership, and the loss of that access was exposing the fragility of the system. The collapse was not the result of a single decision, but of decades of denial. For years, officials ignored warnings that the dependence on African resources was unsustainable. They assumed the status quo would last forever. But when the new generation of Africans chose sovereignty over subservience, France was caught unprepared. The resolution of this crisis did not come from diplomacy or reform. It came from realization. France learned that true power cannot survive without fairness, that wealth built on exploitation carries an expiration date. The nations it once viewed as extensions of its empire had finally turned the page. As Paris burned and its leaders fought over the ashes of a broken system, Africa looked forward. For the first time, the continent was not defined by what it provided to others, but by what it could build for itself. The rejection of uranium was more than an act of defiance. It was the moment the exploited became the independent, and the former master learned what it means to live without control. France's collapse did not happen in a vacuum. It reflected a deeper global transformation already underway. For decades, the Western world operated on a system where power flowed from the same centers, and Africa's role was to provide raw materials while buying finished products at inflated prices. That model is now being rewritten. Across the continent, nations are taking control of their economic destinies. The African Continental Free Trade Area is connecting over 1 billion people in a unified market. Instead of competing for foreign approval, African governments are building internal value chains that keep wealth within their borders. Factories, refineries, and innovation hubs are emerging from Accra to Nairobi. For the first time, Africa is shaping its economy instead of reacting to someone else's design. New partnerships have also shifted the balance of power. The BRICS alliance has offered African nations access to alternative financial systems, trade routes, and investment opportunities. Russia provides energy technology, China builds infrastructure, and India and Brazil open new agricultural and industrial cooperation. These partnerships are imperfect, but they give Africa choices, and choice means freedom. The African diaspora is returning as well. Engineers, economists, and entrepreneurs who once lived abroad are bringing skills and capital home. They are investing in clean energy, fintech, agriculture, and education. What used to be a brain drain is now a brain gain. The movement is not driven by nationalism, but by a belief that Africa's potential has finally become real. France's influence in this new order is fading. Its control through the CFA franc and resource contracts no longer holds. The same nations that once stabilized France's economy are now redefining their own. Paris can no longer rely on cheap uranium or forced currency deposits to sustain its power. The system that once looked eternal has reached its end. Africa's uranium rejection was not simply a political act. It was a declaration of maturity, a signal to the world that a new chapter has begun. The continent that powered others is now powering itself. The message is clear. The future will not be written in Paris, London, or Washington, but in Abuja, Ouagadougou, and Addis Ababa. What happened to France in 2025 is not only a story about one country's collapse. It is a warning to the entire world. Systems built on exploitation can survive for decades, even centuries, but they always fall when those being exploited wake up. France's crisis began the moment Africa stopped asking for permission and started reclaiming its voice. The lesson is simple. Power built on dependence is fragile. True partnership requires equality, transparency, and respect. For too long, nations were told that progress meant obedience, that sovereignty was a dream too expensive to afford. But Africa has shown that dignity has a higher value than any foreign loan or mineral contract. The $500 billion that once flowed silently into Paris is now staying in African hands. It is being used to fund local industries, schools, and hospitals. The same resources that fueled France's wealth are now becoming the foundation of Africa's independence. The continent is not asking for revenge, it is demanding fairness. Every empire believes it will last forever, until the day it discovers that the world has moved on. France is learning this lesson now, and others will soon follow. Any country or corporation that depends on hidden exploitation is living on borrowed time. The age of blind compliance is over. This is not just an African victory. It is a global awakening. It is proof that justice can be achieved through knowledge, unity, and courage. When people see the truth, they cannot unsee it. When they understand their power, they cannot be controlled. The fall of France's old system is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new era. An era where Africa stands not as a supplier to others, but as a leader of its own destiny. The world is watching, and history is being rewritten in real time. The question now is, who will have the courage to follow?